Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis Legacy. Sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis Legacy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteemed Season of the Witch Girl. The aspiring angel takes on a wicked teenage witch in this action-packed, all-new Esteemed series adventure. Pick up your copy of Esteemed Season of the Witch Girl in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. Yesterday, we lost one of the great statesmen of the medium of comics, former Marvel Comics editor Jim Shooter. Now, Jim Shooter sadly passed away at 73 years old of esophageal cancer. However, his legacy in the medium of comics will always be remembered as revolutionizing the industry, and he is going to be remembered for being one of the great craftsmen who basically mastered the craft of comics and took it to another level, and also will be also remembered for being one of the great statesmen of the medium, making it a medium that basically many kids of Generation X became aware of Marvel characters from. Now, Jim Shooter came from very humble beginnings back in the 1960s, as he was growing up in Pittsburgh, where he grew up in a household with a father who worked as a steelworker and a mother who worked as well. And as this how family struggled to make ends meet, Jim decided to go out, and as he was reading Marvel Comics, he decided after he had a surgery to start looking to learn more about the craft of comics. And as he learned more about the craft of comics at 13 years old, Jim Shooter began writing his own stories for the DC comic Legion of Superheroes. And as he wrote stories for the Legion of Superheroes, he decided to submit some of his scripts to DC Comics, and those scripts caught the eye of DC Comics editor Mort Weisinger at the time. And after they caught his eye, Mort Weisinger decided to buy 3 of Jim Shooter's scripts, and after buying 3 of Jim Shooter's scripts, after contacting him, he famously says that they told him to put his mother on the phone because he was 13 years old. But after getting the permission of his mother, he went on to have one of the most storied careers in comic book history. Now, Jim Shooter, as he was working at DC Comics, not only was he working on writing comics, but he worked with one of the greatest craftsmen in the business in DC Comics editor Mort Weisinger. And as he worked with DC Comics editor Mort Weisinger, he got a great education working hands-on with him, learning the craft of comics, something a lot of people really didn't appreciate that Jim had basically learned. He had basically learned the craft of the business, and this is a business where you basically, again, are learning a craft, because the skills you learn as related to storytelling, the skills you learn as related to editing, these are things that are basically passed down from one craftsman to another. And when it came to Jim Shooter, this craftsman basically learned the craft from a master of the craft. And as he learned this craft from a master, he went out here and not only was continuing to write stories for the Legion of Superheroes, but also was given opportunities to write for DC's flagship character, Superman, and was also allowed a chance to write for Supergirl as well. And Jim Shooter went out here and wrote an iconic story as related to Superman racing the Flash, as he was continuing to write stories for Superman and Supergirl, and also got a regular position writing the Legion, as he was again only about 14 years old. And as he was 14 years old, he was writing these comics, helping to support his struggling parents. And as he was out here helping to help his struggling parents, he continued to go on, again, selling stories for other DC comics such as Action Comics and Adventure Comics, and even started doing pencil breakdowns as well. And again, learning the entire writing style of DC Comics, which is more script approached. And as he was working on Legion of Superheroes, he created iconic Legionnaire characters such as Karate Kid, Ferro Lad, and Princess Projector, and also created the Fatal Five bad guys, and also went on to write the first issue of Captain Action, a merchandising comic that DC Comics had done. Now, as Jim Shooter was in his teenage years, eventually he did get accepted into New York University and wanted to work at Marvel Comics. However, he couldn't pursue his studies and work at Marvel, but eventually wound up quitting New York University and quitting DC as well. But eventually, as he was dealing with fiscal issues, what happened with Jim Shooter was he basically wound up again working for Marvel for about 3 weeks, but wound up having to leave because his financial situation had gone dire, and he had to return to Pittsburgh. But eventually he started working in advertising and doing writing and illustration, helping to further hone his craft. And as he looked to further hone his craft, eventually what happened with Jim Shooter was that he basically then, in the mid-1970s, Marvel Comics was going through a series of changes, and eventually what happened with Jim Shooter was that he was contacted by editors at Marvel, and after he was contacted by editors at Marvel, he began working at Marvel Comics, not only as an editor, but also as a writer on what I consider to be one of the greatest runs in comic book history on Marvel Comics Avengers. Now, on Marvel Comics Avengers, Jim Shooter basically started a fantastic run on Marvel's flagship book, and as he started this run, he created great stories like the story that I believe is one that every aspiring comic book writer needs to read, Avengers 164 to 166, where the Avengers take on Count Nefaria. Now, this is what I believe to be the perfect comic book story, and I believe it to be the perfect comic book story because this story basically is a 3-act paradigm where we see a story arc from beginning, middle to end, and the action in this story is so well paced and so well done and so well executed as related to 3 acts in 3 issues that this whole 3-issue arc is the one that any aspiring comic book writer could use to go out here and learn about the craft of comics, and is exceptionally crafted as related to the whole overreaching arc that Jim Shooter established for the Avengers that featured iconic stories such as The Bride of Ultron, the Count Nefaria storyline I just mentioned, and the overall Korvac saga, which I consider to be one of the greatest comic book storylines of all time. I mean, the Korvac saga basically is what I consider to be Jim Shooter's masterpiece of a story, right next to the Count Nefaria storyline in Bride of Ultron. And this overall overreaching arc, again, basically is a template for most comic writers who are out here aspiring for a comic book run. And I don't think the Avengers have been as good as when Jim Shooter was writing them. I mean, he basically showed some rich depth and complexity with these characters. Now, people who read Legion of Superheroes might possibly disagree on that, because Jim Shooter, as he was writing Legion of Superheroes, did also do some fantastic sagas with that series, and also did a great story with Ferro Lad. Now, Jim Shooter wanted to make the Ferro Lad character black, but when editorial told him he could not do that, what happened with Jim Shooter is that he wound up killing the Ferro Lad character in an iconic story, and the Ferro Lad character's identity, again, remained a mystery. But as he came on as a writer, again, that Avengers run of his is what I consider to be one of the greatest runs in comic book history. It's one that I highly recommend you go out here and pick up and read. It's one that I recommend if you are wanting to write comics. This is the run that you go out here and read. And I was really grateful that I was able to read that entire run as part of my brother's comic book collection when I was young, and even able to read it once again when I was older, to be able to appreciate the craftsmanship of that story. I mean, the craftsmanship of that entire Avengers run was, again, you look at the nuances of the story, you look at the layers of each story arc and how they fold together organically, and it just shows the absolute skill of this young man who was just in his 20s, again, didn't even go to college and read literature and great literary books. Again, this guy basically, again, had amazing skill as a comic book writer, and just in his 20s was, again, writing masterpiece storylines, even in his teens, again, writing masterpiece storylines that are considered icons of the medium. I mean, Superman and the Flash having that race, that's something that's considered to be one of the great Superman stories of all time. And here we have Jim Shooter again writing all of these great stories, and that was just the start of his again long career as related to things, and that was going to, again, he was going to go to another level when he was promoted to editor-in-chief. Now, Stan Lee was running Marvel Comics for some time, and then there was some issues with editorial as things were going on, and Stan wanted to go into television and animation to supervise that, and Jim Shooter was recruited to be the next editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics, and this is where he was able to apply many of the approaches as he related to the craft of comics to editorial and really get Marvel's editorial on point. Now, before Jim Shooter came in, Marvel was having problems with its editorial, and its editorial wasn't making sure that these comics were made up to a standard. No, when it came to Marvel, basically, books, artists were turning in books whenever they wanted. Books were being released whenever they could come out, and there was no real standard or consistency to any of the stories. And it was Jim Shooter who came in and basically gave us what we now know as the Marvel Universe. Now, yes, there was a world of Marvel as related to characters, but when Jim Shooter came in and started establishing standards for Marvel, this is where we got a lot of consistency as related to the comics being produced at Marvel. This is where we got a lot of consistency as related to things, and as I was reading books in my brother's collection when I was young, from the late 70s when Jim Shooter was in charge, I noticed that the storytelling became a lot tighter, a lot of the storytelling became a lot more consistent, and a lot of the books basically synergized with each other, and that was all due to the strict standards that Jim Shooter put in place for most of Marvel Comics. And as he put those standards in place, the quality of the books dramatically improved to the point where you could follow one book to another and see that there was a consistent world going on as related to all of the books. And this basically made Marvel Comics a lot more easier to read because Jim Shooter also established a standard as related to making every Marvel comic an entry point. Again, an entry point that was easy for a young reader to get in, whether they be in the middle of a story arc or at the beginning of a story arc. You could get into these books and either go forward with the books or go backward with the books, and that was all due to the standards that Jim Shooter put in place for Marvel Comics, and basically gave us one of the greatest eras in comics that basically ran over a decade, from about 1978 to about 1987 when he was terminated. And Jim Shooter basically again gave us one of the greatest eras of comics. And when I was sitting there, I was reading some comics online, I was reading old issues of Avengers, and I was just floored at how tight these books were and how consistent they were. And then I read other books like Fantastic Four and Alpha Flight, and the quality on them was just so amazing. I mean, the quality on them was just, again, absolutely amazing. I mean, every book flowed into every other book. Every character's action was on point and motivated for reasons and logic. The storylines, again, were consistent from book to book, and the quality of those books hasn't been replicated in over 30 years, and it was all due to Jim Shooter's leadership at Marvel Comics that basically led to Generation X basically getting some of the greatest comics in history. I mean, my generation was greatly blessed by Jim Shooter to get some of the greatest comics in history and get some of the greatest continuity as related to comics. I mean, when we went to the bodega here in the Bronx, you just knew you were going to get great books, and you got lots of great different concepts. I mean, Jim Shooter not only went out here and gave us great comics, with his Avengers run, but he also oversaw, again, many great milestones in Marvel Comics. He oversaw the Phoenix Saga. He oversaw Frank Miller's Daredevil run. He basically oversaw whole different storylines that were iconic, like Tony Stark's alcoholism issue and Jim Rhodes becoming Iron Man. He oversaw the West Coast Avengers. He oversaw, again, many great storylines like the entire John Byrne Fantastic Four run. I mean, all of those books basically were top sellers over at Marvel, top sellers that basically lifted Marvel up and made Marvel the #1 comic company in the world. And that was all due to Jim Shooter's strong leadership that Marvel became, again, a powerhouse. Now, as Jim Shooter was out here making the Marvel Universe a more consistent and tight place as related to storytelling, he was also expanding Marvel's business with different ventures like the Epic comic book line and the books like the licensed movie comics, like the Star Wars comics. I guess he got that from Captain Action and realized, hey, these licensed comics, again, the company's going to pay us for these comics, and we can just go out here and sell those comics. And that's where we got licensed comics like Star Wars, Transformers, G.I. Joe. Again, Generation X staple comics. I mean, these were comics that basically were a part of my childhood as related to life. And these comics, again, were a big part of our lives. Again, waiting at the newsstand or the bodega or the cigar candy store. I mean, you look forward to seeing these comics on Friday. And again, Jim basically defined Generation X's childhood at the 7-Elevens. We basically, again, we not only got Marvel superheroes, we not only got movie comics, but we got comics for children in the Star line, along with the Epic Illustrated line with books like Dreadstar and many other comics. So Jim was expanding Marvel's brand and expanding Marvel's business, and also introduced different story approaches for Marvel Comics that in order to help books that had struggling sales, I mean B and C books like Iron Man and Alpha Flight and many other books. He created what they call the event story model, which basically allowed books to cross over with each other. And again, you had this big event going on. First one, I believe, was Contest of Champions. Then there was the Secret Wars. And again, Secret Wars was a major book. That was a major book for a lot of for a lot of reasons, because this was Marvel's first big event with Marvel's characters as related to licensing and merchandising, and it was Marvel's first big event as related to, again, Marvel being known as a major brand. So Jim Shooter oversaw this, and he also wrote all 12 issues of the Secret Wars. And as he wrote those 12 issues of the Secret Wars, again, those books and the merchandise became a major part of 1980s pop culture. And as it became a major part of pop culture, it led to the iconic Black Spider-Man costume, which Jim Shooter basically bought from another person who created it. He bought it for over, I think, about $260. And that was, again, another great investment, because the Symbiote saga, as related to the black costume, is one of the major stories of the 1980s. And it basically spawned not only Spider-Man's black costume, but also spurred sales and also led to the introduction of one of Spider-Man's most popular villains, known as Venom. So Jim Shooter basically, again, had a major impact on 1980s pop culture as related to Marvel Comics, expanding them to become a major brand, and again led to the publication of other ongoing titles in the direct sales market, such as Dazzler and Marvel Fanfare and Kazar, and again other books. He also oversaw the Marvel graphic novel division as related to stories. Now, a lot of those graphic novels, again, a lot of people didn't take them very seriously, but they were all major canon stories, such as Dazzler the movie, Avengers Emperor Doom, The Aladdin Effect, The Death of Captain Marvel. Again, the graphic novel program, again, had a major impact as related to the comic business, in that these were books that could be sold in bookstores, and not only comic book stores, but bookstores as well, and allow Marvel to reach those casual customers at the comic shops. And as he was out here, again, he had a lot of great successes as related to things, had a lot of great successes as related to things, and also went out here and helped out comic creators as related to not only maintaining those standards, but also went out here and looked to help the fellow comic creators by doing things like creating an art return program so that comic creators' art just wouldn't be sitting in some warehouse. The comic creator would also be able to benefit from being able to get their art back and then be able to sell those pages later on. Again, creating a secondary market for old comic art. That was something Jim Shooter instituted, and he also instituted royalties for books that passed certain benchmarks on sales for creators, and was looking to do further things before he had several setbacks that basically led to the end of his term at Marvel. Now, two things that happened to Jim Shooter at the end of his career at Marvel was he wanted to go out here and launch a new universe of books, but sadly, this new universe of books, which were hugely interesting concepts and fresh, unique ideas, didn't go over well in about 1986 or 1987, and that whole line after it tanked was one of the things that led to Jim Shooter having problems. The other one was he was getting a lot of friction from comic creators at Marvel as related to his strong editorial control and his strict adherence to deadlines, and this basically upset a lot of comic creators to the point where some went to move over to DC, and an alleged incident that took place that led to Jim Shooter's termination, where it's alleged that comic artist John Byrne, again, burned some comics in a Jim Shooter effigy, and this led to people who were running Marvel to terminate Jim Shooter. But that whole incident basically led to the complete collapse of Marvel, I believe, started the whole decline of Marvel. But under Jim Shooter's strong leadership, Marvel Comics was a dominant company, was the #1 comic company, and many of the comics that he created and helped support creators on basically created the entire speculator boom of the late 1980s and early 1990s. That was all, I believe, due to the successful leadership of Jim Shooter as related to his run at Marvel. And his run at Marvel basically revolutionized comics because, again, this was an era where we got some of the best writing. We got some of the best writers in the business, like Frank Miller, like David Michelinie, like Peter David, and Chris Claremont at their best. And we got some of the best artists working at Marvel who were basically rookies, guys like George Perez, guys like John Byrne, guys like Frank Miller, guys like Mark Silvestri and many others. Again, many people and the late Butch guys. Let me not forget the late Butch guys who basically passed away about 2 weeks ago. I wanted to do a tribute to him, but I just didn't have the time. But again, these were people who learned the craft of comics under Jim Shooter and basically learned as standards as related to things. Now, some people, again, at Marvel had issues with Jim Shooter as an editor-in-chief, but the whole thing is, and they would say he's abrasive, but when it comes down to the publishing business, Jim Shooter basically was just what I would call a guy just doing his job. I mean, he really reminded me of the Gordon Ramsay lead chef who has the reality show Hell's Kitchen, in that he had very strict standards and he wanted people to, again, learn the craft of business because he was passionate about the craft of comics. He was very passionate and he wanted to share that craft with people, but they didn't understand how it works in a publishing house or a place like a magazine or a newspaper. Many comic pros basically were used to, again, being comfortable. They weren't used to being competitive like in an actual publishing, and that's why they really had issues with Jim Shooter, because they were used to just, again, coasting as related to things. But in a competitive marketplace like publishing, it's really, you have to be on point, and that's what Jim Shooter was trying to help people become as competitive as many of the newsrooms like the New York Times or Vogue magazine, which was, again, basically, I think it was run by Anna Wintour. And again, they said Anna Wintour was a very harsh woman. And again, Anna Wintour insisted that there were high standards for Vogue's fashion and its fashion articles and its photographs. And that's what Jim Shooter was doing over at Marvel. But a lot of people couldn't appreciate the craft he was teaching and the things that he was doing. Some people would say that he got gassed up after Secret Wars, but the whole thing is he wanted to maintain standards. And a lot of people in publishing that like comics, they don't understand that things do change. A lot of people are saying, "Oh, Jim Shooter was changing things," and I talked about this in a previous video. They talked about how he was changing things, but he was changing things for the better. And then what they didn't understand is that in order to maintain standards, it has to change because storylines change over time, characters grow over time, techniques as related to writing and art have to change, and he was trying to keep things, again, flowing as related to things. But a lot of people in comics at the time didn't appreciate that he was basically trying to continue improving the craft of comics, to make it much better. And sadly, what happened with Jim Shooter is in 1987, after that alleged incident as related to the effigy burning that was videotaped, Jim Shooter was let go from Marvel Comics, and Marvel Comics never had a level of popularity outside of that speculator boom in the 90s like they had under his leadership. Now, after Jim Shooter wound up leaving Marvel Comics, he then went on to work with Voyager Communications on their Valiant Comics line, and as he worked with them on their Valiant Comics line, what happened with Valiant Comics is Valiant Comics went on to become a big hit as related to being an independent comic company. It became very competitive under Jim Shooter's leadership. Under his leadership, books like Solar Man of the Atom, Magnus Robot Fighter, and Exo Manowar became household names, and under his leadership, that company grew and again became a very strong company. And under Jim Shooter's leadership, again, these books again sold very well. For an independent company, Valiant was extremely competitive, and that was all due to Jim Shooter's leadership because he understood how to run a publishing house. I think this guy, if he wasn't just in the comics, he could have run a company like Random House or a company like one of the other books like Penguin. Back when they weren't merged, he could have basically run one of those publishing houses. That's how skilled this man was as related to the business. And as he was working at Valiant, sadly, what happened was internal politics led to him being pushed out of the company. But even though he had been pushed out of the company, he got the company up to a standard and again got everybody on the same page as related to, again, knowing how to do the comics in Valiant style. He brought in other craftsmen and had them working on books, and he also was able to start again getting this company again strong and competitive, because I remember Valiant in the 90s, again, really good quality books. Very good quality books as related to the overall quality. It wasn't like Image where, yeah, you had guys like Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, and Todd McFarlane on books which were all flash and no substance. No, the storytelling on these books at Valiant was on the level of Marvel and DC, and basically he brought in, again, top quality talent like Bob Layton and Barry Windsor Smith, and veterans like Don Perlin into Valiant, and again made this into one of the strongest comic companies in the 90s until it was bought by Acclaim Entertainment. And again, after Shooter was let go, the quality again fell off once more. Now, Jim Shooter, after being kicked out of Valiant in 1992, decided to go and fund his own Defiant Comics. And as he funded Defiant Comics with his own money, he basically, again, the company wound up having to deal with issues as related to things. And eventually what happened was with Defiant Comics, again, the company went out of business in a year because of people in the industry, again, participating in backbiting and looking to undermine Jim Shooter. Now, in 1995, he decided to go and create Broadway Comics, which was an offshoot of Broadway Video, and worked at Broadway Comics as related to things. And as he worked at Broadway Comics, again, he again had to deal with issues as related to that business, as related to people in the business. I believe somebody sued him as related to one of these companies. On a book he did called Warriors of Plasm. I think that was with Defiant that had happened again, and that undermined him. And then he was undermined once more as related to Broadway Comics. And eventually he did then return to Valiant for a minute, but Valiant basically went out of business under Acclaim. And then after that, he then joined a custom comics book company in 2003 called Illustrated Media, where he worked as a creative director and editor-in-chief. And then he worked on other freelance comics here and there, and also entered into the convention circuit. And as he was on the convention circuit, he was out here again working on meeting different people and meeting a lot of different people in comics. And this is where I wish I could have again been able to have money, because I would have loved to have met Jim Shooter. Now in the mid 2000s, he did have a blog, I believe, or the 2010s. He had a blog, and that blog really helped me out. I mean, that blog was it had a major impact on me as related to me looking to build SJS Direct and my SJS Direct imprint, and one of his blogs where he talked about entry points. This is something that I apply to my own writing to this day. And Jim Shooter in that blog said every story is an entry point, and that basically made me rethink my approaches to storytelling as related to building the SJS Direct universe. So when I listened to Jim and him saying every story is an entry point, I try to make sure that every Isis, Esteem, John Haynes, or book like Spinsterella or Eternal Night be its own entry point for a new reader, where every story has a easy to understand beginning, middle, and end. And I tried to make sure that every story that I write is accessible to readers. And I can honestly say, after applying Jim Shooter's approaches to storytelling, I was able to have an impact on readers, in that readers were able to go out here and pick up any Isis, Esteem, John Haynes, or Spinsterella, or even books like The Thetas or Eternal Night, and be able to just pick up any book and start reading. And as they started reading, they could go back into the backlist catalog of books in the SJS Direct imprint, or they could go forward with new books. And I've seen people go out here and pick up entire runs of the Isis series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, and Spinsterella books, or after reading Eternal Night or other one-shot books like the Thetas, again, come in and have no problem entering the SJS Direct universe. And that was all due to just reading one of Jim Shooter's blogs. I mean, this man, again, was a master of his craft and a master craftsman as related to the comic medium. Now, some would say he's abrasive, but the whole thing is he was a statesman for the business. He was a face for the business that basically established high standards and high quality to a medium that was considered to be low quality. And he basically applied, again, a high standard to everything that made comics accessible to an entire generation of readers, and defined an entire generation of readers like myself from Generation X with multiple comic book storylines like the Korvac saga, like the Phoenix saga, like the John Byrne run on Fantastic Four, like the death of Captain Marvel, like the Frank Miller Daredevil run, like the limited series like he did with the Punisher, like crossover events like Contest of Champions and Secret Wars, like Spider-Man's black costume, like Captain America winding up losing his costume to John Walker, Henry Pym and Janet Pym's divorce. Tony Stark bout with alcoholism. I mean, this man's run of editorial at comics basically defined an entire generation of readers and the stories that we saw, and basically, again, was a major part of our lives as related to pop culture. I mean, Jim Shooter's run on comics is as iconic as the movies in the original Star Wars trilogy in Generation X's childhood. And this man had, again, a major impact on children's lives. Again, this man, again, enriched children's lives and opened up children's imaginations. I mean, he was one of the, again, a gifted and talented man. Again, a man who I basically, again, learned so much from just reading his blogs when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, and I was working on building SJS Direct. I mean, I learned so much from just reading Jim Shooter's blog, and I wonder how much more I could have learned if I ever got that chance to actually, again, meet him at one of these Comic-Cons, or even be able to, again, talk to him online. I mean, this man was a brilliant creator, and again, not only a brilliant creator, but a great editor-in-chief. A lot of people didn't appreciate him back in the 80s, but a lot of people now in 2025, with how bad Marvel Comics are, basically appreciate Jim Shooter and everything that he did to establish structure and order now that we look at the modern Marvel Comics. But I will always appreciate Jim Shooter for giving me great childhood memories as related to Marvel Comics as a boy, and I will always appreciate everything that he did to expand the comic book medium growing up in the 1980s, and I'll always appreciate him for, again, taking the time to teach the craft of comics in his blog. I mean, everything that he taught in his blog basically helped me tremendously towards building the SJS Direct imprint. And one thing that I regret about Jim Shooter is that I was thinking about, again, I followed him on Facebook, and I wanted to send him a direct message letting him know everything that he had presented and how it helped me out, and I never really got that chance to write that post and let him know what he had done, because oftentimes when I have people who inspire me, I oftentimes let them know that how they inspired me. Like in the case of Sally Richardson Whitfield, I let her know that she inspired the Esteemed character, and I will sometimes again go to people's social media and let them know how much they have influenced me. I'll just let them know how it has done, and I wish I could have had that opportunity to, write that post to Jim Shooter and let him know, again, the impact he had on me as a child and had it on me as a writer and as a publisher. I wish I had that opportunity to let this man know, again, his influence as related to helping me develop my craft as a writer and understanding that this whole medium of comics is a craft. That's one of the things that Jim Shooter understood, that this is a craft, and looked to teach this craft to the next generation of comic creators. But sadly, many comic creators didn't appreciate the craft that they were being passed on to by Jim Shooter. They weren't appreciative that, hey, this guy is giving me craft and again teaching me skills that I would not learn. He basically again got that opportunity of a lifetime, and sadly Jim Shooter isn't here to again pass his knowledge on to the next generation anymore. But all of us who did learn from him, we have to pass that legacy on, because the medium of comics basically again was enriched by Jim Shooter, a man who will be greatly missed and a man I greatly appreciate for everything that he has done for this overall business. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis: Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis: Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online booksellers everywhere today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer. Take a trip into the macabre world of goth modeling in the new millennium in this spooktacular Spinsterella story. Pick up your copy of Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.